أكبر الله أكبر.
Here we are again, Sunday, 10 p.m. It's the Call to Freedom with Will Coley and my amazing, illustrious co-host, Davi Barker.
How's it going?
I'm doing good tonight, man. I'm doing better than I deserve, alhamdulillah. How you doing tonight?
I'm pretty good. I'm loaded up on junk food, so I'm ready to go.
Oh yeah, I've been power loading on coffee since I got off of work. I got this really, really nice Colombian blend. Ground some up before the show started. Brewed a pot about halfway through it. So yeah, I should be particularly entertaining tonight. So we have our special guest co-host tonight. He is a co-host of Free Talk Live. I've known him for a few years. He's worked with, tons and tons of different, liberty organizations throughout his career with radio and with, he's an early mover for the Free State Project too, I think. Mr. Mark Edge. Everybody say hello to Mark.
Hello, everybody.
So it's great to have you with us tonight, Mark. I've been a big fan of yours for, at least 5 years now. And, I've been listening to you on the air. You guys have been trailblazers as far as being people who, you're on conservative radio, most of the time. You're on, AM and FM radio that, they play talk radio 24 hours a day on these stations, and 3 of those hours every day they get to have a rational voice talking and advocating for freedom in an objective way where it's not freedom for some and not freedom for others. It's not freedom on some issues and not freedom on others. Your guys' show has really laid the groundwork as far as the entertainment industry's libertarian radio broadcasts. I mean, nationally, you guys are it.
Yeah, I think it's amazing what's happened with Free Talk Live. And I think, I don't know why it is. I'm not going to propose to know that other than Ian and my ability to, live on very little when we first started in order to get things up and rolling in the first couple of years. But we have achieved something that's really pretty amazing is amongst all these corporate funded big Democrat and big Republican shows out there, we're able to put on a show that talks about the issues coming from the standpoint of liberty, and this is something that just isn't happening on too many other shows. The Freedom Fiends is another one worth mentioning, but Free Talk Live's on 150 stations, and that puts us on radio stations that people weren't necessarily expecting to hear the message of liberty on. So I guess it's push medium for the ideas of liberty instead of pull medium. This is inside marketing terminology.
And not only that, but you guys have really kind of changed the paradigm as far as how media is able to get out there. You guys literally created a network of, go out and build your own FM stations so that you can facilitate this message getting out. And now you have people that in places all over the country. I've even talked to Issa Hodge, who's, a big Muslim activist in Kansas City, who's talking about, like, I'm building a studio on my house right now, and I'm incorporating the idea of having an LRN FM station in my backyard so that I'm able to broadcast this message as well as, shows like mine and shows like, the show that he's on to crowds. And I mean, this is happening all over the country, and you guys kind of put that whole thing together.
Yeah, well, Ian is dedicated when it comes to the idea of individual broadcast, people putting up their own stations and being able to have freedom of speech on the airwaves. 100 years ago when the progressive movement was, in full swing, the idea was the airwaves belong to the public. Well, no one's really challenged. I mean, Do they really belong to the public? I'm not sure they do. I think that a person should be able to broadcast as long as they're not stepping on somebody else's signal. They should be able to broadcast what they want to broadcast.
Awesome. So now we have another guest on tonight. We usually have a guest academic, and I have to say, like, this is a meeting of the minds here. Two powerhouses in their respective movements, and having the two of you here, the ability to kind of pick each other's brains as we go through the upcoming topic tonight is something that I'm really, really excited about. Having the two of you on together specifically, I think it's going to be an absolute blast. Now, who we've got with us tonight, his name is it's Imam Zaid Shakir. Now, a lot of you guys that are listening, if you're Muslim, you've heard his name before. Now, for those of you who haven't, though, Imam Zaid is the co-founder of Zaytuna College. It's the first Islamic liberal arts college in America. It's located in Berkeley, California. He is trained in both the academic and religious intellectual traditions. Imam Zaid is uniquely qualified as a commentator on the substantial issues of our time. He's a compelling force for the improvement of race relations in America and amongst the most respected global Islamic scholars. The New York Times described him as a, quote, leading intellectual light. He has served as an advisor to many organizations and influential leaders, as a gifted author and lecturer. Imam Zaid Shakir recently was ranked as one of the most influential scholars in the West by the 500 Most Influential Muslims, edited by John Esposito and Ibrahim Kalin. So without further ado, Imam Zaid Shakir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
It is absolutely amazing to have you on. It is a total honor to have the opportunity to speak with you, to have you come on and to talk to our listening audience tonight, and reach an audience that you may not always have access to. And you gave a lecture. I want to say about 3 years ago at an event that I went to, and it had a pretty profound impact on my life, as well as the way that that I run the organization that I work for, Muslims for Liberty. And I thought that alternative leadership concepts is a subject that is particularly interesting to our listeners on LRN.FM. So I wanted to have you on, specifically kind of to talk about that, but then, later to, maybe do some questions about some other, things that the Liberty community find important, and, have a dialogue about that later. So perhaps you could just give us a quick run-in on that?
Yeah. Quick meaning how long? Just give me an estimate. I don't know how to pace and what to say.
We go out to break in probably about 4 minutes, and then
4 minutes. Okay, great.
Pretty surprising. I mean, I've been on dating sites before, and usually you don't get a message within 15 minutes of signing up.
24 hours is a good time frame you'd think you'd wait before somebody would message you.
Are mostly male. Most dating sites probably are mostly males, and how many of the women who are actually there listed on the site are actually regularly visiting the site. Some sites they don't tell you, other sites they do. Like OkCupid will let you know, oh, this person logged in at the last time they logged in was this date. I couldn't find any of that information on the paranormal date site about how recently their users had logged in. But to me that was
off in a pasture getting probed or something.
To me that was red alert number one. Oh, I just signed up for the website and I've already got a message from somebody. Okay, and so then I got the same message from the same profile on the other site that I'd signed up on, both of the other sites that I'd signed up for.
Well, if that was intended to be scammy, then they could easily make it a different picture from a different person. It doesn't have to be the same person, right?
Yep, that's right. And
there's a rebuttal here regarding
oh, it gets much worse. Our toll-free number is 855-450-FREE if you want to comment on if you've ever joined. I know you probably don't want to admit it, but if you've ever joined one of these scam dating websites and you want to share your experience, you can do that here. You can also live Sunday edition of Free Talk Live, 855-450-FREE. on Free Talk Live.
Welcome back. Welcome back to the Call to Freedom on LRN.FM. So we are here with Davi Barker.
How's it going?
And Mark Edge from Free Talk Live, along with our special guest academic, Imam Zaid Shakir from New Islamic Directions, right? Isn't that your flagship organization, Imam Zaid?
Yes, sir. It is indeed.
So he was just starting to kind of walk us through an introduction to this idea of a non-linear leadership model that was offered by the Prophet ﷺ.
Yeah, and so I'll continue that, but as quickly as possible so we can engage in a conversation. So I just mentioned the idea of the strong, independent, self-reliant individual, coupled with the idea of leadership or stewardship. All of you are stewards, and each of you are responsible for his or her wards. So everyone has a realm of responsibility, and everyone is encouraged to exercise his or her personal responsibility. So to be strong, to be independent, to be self-reliant, to be not to shy away from leadership, and not to shirk one's responsibilities, but to assume one's responsibilities, not to expect or rely on some outside agent or agency intervening to assume the responsibilities that individuals should assume, and then coming together to form communities that respect those values. Another interesting saying, and all of these are rooted in sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Another one is that he forbade hearsay, wasting wealth, squandering wealth, and excessive questioning. And so relevant for this particular topic is the issue of excessive questioning. In other words, figure it out for yourself. Don't constantly seek for someone to provide you with the answers so that you become stagnant or intellectually lazy, or not just in the intellectual realm. Figure out how to change your own tire, figure out how to, if necessary, grow your own food in your backyard. Just work it out and become a person that gets in the habit, again, of developing strength within himself or herself, of assuming one's responsibility, of accepting the challenges that just living as an individual and living in the context of human society presents to one. So these are all values that are encouraged by our religion, by Islam. And a final thing I'll say to before I turn it back over to you fine gentlemen who are hosting and other guests on the program, is that this thing we see today, there's so much in the news, and it constitutes the topic of so much talk, probably on these sort of forums, is this whole idea of the hegemonic Muslim state, that this whole idea of the Islamic State is this sort of hegemonic, all-powerful, intrusive element. That this whole idea is a very recent phenomenon that is really a direct result of the influence of modernity on Muslim societies. It's not something that has any sort of deep-rooted history amongst the Muslim people. The Muslim state has always been a limited state. It's been a state that over and beyond protecting the people, securing the borders to the extent that there were any sort of demarcated borders, and collecting taxes to allow government to function. And taxes meaning a zakat, 2.5% of one's disposable income.
I can live with that.
That was pretty much it.
This brings up some questions for me. This is Mark Edge, host of the radio show Free Talk Live. I don't know that much about Islam, but I think you're right that people will say Islamic countries, and they'll just kind of lump them all together. When I was growing up, I remember, there were several sort of presidents and leaders of Islamic countries that were female, and then there's, it's pretty obvious that, today in, say, places like Afghanistan, where they've got to wear the burqa that covers the whole thing, that there's obviously different beliefs and sensibilities in different countries that might have majority Islamic population. How do you address that issue when people talk to you about that?
If you could be more specific when you say that issue, which issue specifically? You mentioned a couple.
Yeah, I think that what people, the question that people have, and many times I'm just talking sort of about ignorant Americans who don't know that much about Islam, is that they're told over and over again about these Islamic countries and how they treat women. But what they're doing is, in those situations, they're lumping in local cultural practices and calling it Islam when it clearly isn't. How do you help people distinguish what is obvious to me?
I think, number one, as you mentioned, there are a lot of cultural variations. So as Muslims, we're encouraged, male and female, to dress modestly. What that means varies from society to society. In some cases, that might mean, based on local cultural realities, historical factors, it might mean something for a woman like a burqa, but ideally, I wouldn't even say ideally, I would say in a normative sense, as a choice that she makes, and not as something that some government or some individual, a husband or a brother or some evil male forces on her. Now, definitely, we do have, as I said, we have these recent manifestations of the Islamic State, and a lot of these political arrangements are very much hegemonic, very much extremely oppressive and intrusive. But these are rare and they're recent. And so, what does modesty mean in Waziristan? It means a burqa. What does it mean in Malaysia? It means something entirely different. What does it mean in most African Muslim societies that have, in many instances, have matriarchal structures? It means something entirely different, both in terms of dress, in terms of social custom, in terms of gender relations. So as you say, there's a mixed bag of things. And I think the common denominator, though, is our attitudes here in the West, where people will deny the Muslim woman herself any agency, that in a particular cultural context, she chooses to dress a particular way or she chooses not to. It depends on, so in parts of Afghanistan now that aren't controlled by the Taliban, for example, like Kabul, the capital, you'll see women in burqa, which is their choice. That's how they choose to manifest their modesty. And you'll see women in Western dress. That's their choice.
So when we come back,
and
we're gonna,
everything in between.
When we come back, we're going to get back into this conversation. And Imam Zaid and Mark Edge on the as soon as we get back, guys. And we're back. So we've been having a great conversation here for the last 30 minutes or so with Davi and Mark Edge of Free Talk Live, as well as Imam Zaid Shakir from the Zaytuna Institute and New Islamic Directions. So we were going to get back into that now that we're back. Now, Mark and Imam Zaid, we're having a discussion about basically the media's use of the term Muslim country, as kind of this blanket term where, they say Muslim country and it's the realities of life on the ground in Turkey are different than realities of life in Mauritania, or the realities of life in Kenya or in Morocco or Saudi Arabia. But these nuances aren't taken into account at all when the concept or the idea of quote unquote Muslim countries are discussed in the media, and how exactly Imam Zaid tries to respond to attacks that are made against Muslims based on that type of an argument.
Something I want to add to this, some sort of this discussion, is I think this is in some sense a function of the internet and the way in which global connectivity is changing the discussion both among Muslims internally and the media in general. And it's because, like, up until maybe a couple hundred years ago, like, it was considered an integral part of Islam that when a person asked for a ruling or a legal opinion or a religious stance, they took it into account the culture of the place the questioner and the answerer were from, and they didn't necessarily communicate across the world. But now you have people who are preaching their sort of local positions to a global internet. And so somebody who's non-Muslim can say, hey, look at this like guy saying this strange thing in this like Bedouin tribe somewhere. What do you Muslim in New York think about that? Like, this is a new phenomenon.
I think though you how you phrased it is preaching the local tribal fatwa, if you will, to a global audience. If only that were the case. Oftentimes they're preaching to their tribe or to their local village, but they're using the internet oblivious to the fact that what you're saying to this one individual who's seeking religious guidance on a particular issue is going to immediately be accessible to people all over the world. And so I think if that particular mufti or the person giving that religious opinion were cognizant of the fact that, listen, everyone on the face of this earth or who has an internet connection is going to have access to this. So I need to frame it in a way that answers the question on the one hand, but takes into account the fact that a lot of people listening to this may be totally oblivious to the most basic thing about Islam in general, or the most basic thing related to this specific issue that I'm talking about. So I think that would be extremely helpful. So I think that's a very good point that you brought up there, Davi.
Another question I had is there's this terminology in Islam that I've heard before, the caliphate. And what my understanding is, sort of as an ignorant Westerner, is that this is the idea that there should be some overarching Islamic government that rules all of the Islamic countries. I don't know. This is what I've been told. Can you address what is the caliphate? What does it mean to you?
Number one, right now, it's something that, from a political perspective, is irrelevant because the political situation necessary for that just doesn't exist. So if a group like ISIS, who are working more with the modern idea of a state, we've carved out this territorial entity, we have sovereign over it, and therefore it's a state. That's a Western idea. And because we control this state, we're going to declare a caliphate. Right now, it would be just strictly a spiritual reality where there was the equivalent. I shouldn't say it in these terms because it would be different, but a leadership that reflects something like the leadership of the Pope over the Catholics in the current situation, where the Muslim world is fragmented, where there is no viable political unity, and most importantly, a caliph, who would be the individual over a legitimate caliphate, would have to have the consensus of the entire Muslim community globally, and not the consensus of a terrorist organization that gains control over a small piece of territory. And so the fact that the very mechanisms at a political level, at a global communicational level, at so many different levels just don't exist for us to be even talking about a global Muslim caliphate. But to the extent that if we can move into the realm of theory, we're talking about the leadership first spiritually and at a theoretical level politically of the Muslim community, and not some sort of global hegemon that's endeavoring to take over the world.
So it'd be leadership, a political leadership that people sort of voluntarily allowed for themselves. So the Pope can
absolutely.
Here's how I like to look at it, and this is. Go ahead.
Sorry. So not only that, but if I'm not mistaken, according to the texts themselves, as Imam Zaid said, that it would be a person that would require the consensus of the Muslim community, but it would have to be a consensus that they themselves didn't actually seek out. That the example of the Prophet.
Oh, the individual that might have the office didn't seek out, but the consensus is something conferred by Muslims.
Yeah. Well,
you and I.
It wasn't a position of power that they sought. That's something that the Prophet ﷺ specifically warned against, was giving power to people who sought seats of power, that you were supposed to avoid giving power to those who sought after it. So
I have a really different view on this whole thing. So for me, I always go back. There's only one place in the Quran where like the word khalifa is used, and it's to describe Adam and his stewardship over his body and his property, right? That Adam was given this vice regency by God to be the steward of, and that's what this word means. It means steward. So there are caliphates right now. Like, I am the steward of my body and my property. That property is a caliphate, and I'm a caliph, and so is everyone else.
This is what we started with. I mentioned all of your stewards.
Yeah, exactly.
In that sense.
And so a political or a social construction of a caliphate is built upon oaths. It's not like a person just comes and sticks a flag in a mountain and says that it's theirs. A person has to either give an oath to someone or receive an oath from someone. And so this is essentially just a network of contracts. That's what it means, is we're all stewards of our bodies and our property and our contracts. And when those oaths accumulate into a social structure, that's what we're talking about.
Oh, you can say that. And I think what's important here also, the term itself is not something that has been universally accepted by Muslims, in the sense that Khalifa, in this sort of socio-political, spiritual sense of communal leadership, is something that the leaders of the community see. It simply means successor. And so Abu Bakr, the first successor of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, after the passing of the Prophet, he was called the Khalifa. But the second successor...
But when we get back, we will pick up on that same point. This is Will Coley with the Call to Freedom on LRN.FM. All right, we are back. So yeah, we've spent the last 45 minutes or so having a great conversation with Mark Edge and Imam Zaid Shakir. We've discussed the concept of an Islamic state, and went through some what is exactly an Islamic state. What are they? Is the idea of a caliphate a single political entity? Is it what exactly is it? How does it apply historically? So this is why we have the show. This is exactly why we are on the air, is so that we can have the opportunity to bring qualified academic voices like this, having these great conversations with people, people in the liberty community that we all respect, and having these meeting of the minds, so our audience can have an opportunity to experience that. I want to thank Imam Zaid Shakir and welcome him back. Thank him for staying with us for a little while longer. And definitely, pick up where we left off. Now, the idea of a state. Now, we all in the liberty community, we understand that word with a specific definition. It's even a definition that the President of the United States, Barack Obama himself, has used when speaking publicly, and it's that entity which has the monopoly of the right to use force or violence against the remainder of the populace within a given geographic border. Now, Davi and myself, for the last 4 or 5 years, we have been coming to events in the liberty community and arguing that classical Islam, following the Median example set out by the Prophet ﷺ, has no concept of this monopoly of the right to use force or violence. This is a decentralized idea with competing courts among different faith traditions and different cultural traditions, and this idea of the decentralization of power is something that is within the framework itself of Islam, of not giving the state this all-encompassing hegemonic power over the people, that people themselves are vice regents and protectors of their property and of their persons, and that you don't need these other entities in order to protect you. You have the ability to protect yourself. And I definitely want to get back into that conversation and welcome our guests back, Mark and Imam Zaid. Get back to it, guys. So what's your opinion, Imam?
I want to say that, and I'll hear more about it.
This idea that Davi and I have been talking about that, in the Median quote unquote state, that there wasn't really a monopoly on the right to use force or violence, that the Prophet ﷺ wasn't the vice regent or the political or judicious leader over the Christians, that they had their own leaderships among themselves, their own judiciaries among themselves, and that this quote-unquote right to use force was something that wasn't held a monopoly on, but was actually decentralized across different faith and tribal and cultural traditions.
Right. Just to quickly finish something I was mentioning before, and that is, and then segue into that, is that in terms of the whole idea of a caliphate, that the earliest Muslims didn't even agree on the term. Abu Bakr, who was the successor of the Prophet, peace be upon him, he was the Khalifa in the sense that it meant in that context, a successor. And then when Omar, the second leader of the community, succeeded Abu Bakr, he refused the term because he said, I'm not the successor of the Prophet. I'm the successor of, peace be upon him, I'm the successor of Abu Bakr. And so he chose the title Amirul Mu'mineen, or the commander of the faithful, or the leader of the faithful. And so at that point, the term that would sort of give birth to the idea wasn't even accepted at that very early date. And so it just shows the way these ideas are evolving, and they evolve according to context. The context of Omar different from the context of Abu Bakr. And in the modern world, the context we find ourselves in differs from the context that existed in that early time or in medieval times, just in chronologically in the evolution of the Muslim community. And it's a betrayal of tradition to go back to a particular period and uncritically try to replicate that period, totally oblivious to the context you find yourself in. And so to lead into the question that was asked, the whole idea of the legitimate use of force being the specific purvey of the state, this is a modern concept. This is one of the definitions of a type of modern state. And as you two fine gentlemen have been arguing over the past few years, it has nothing to do with Islam, that everyone has the right of anyone to use force is governed by the same principles that are applicable to those who assume the administrative and leadership functions that of what might be called the government and the ordinary citizens. There's one standard. And taking an innocent life, be it the perpetrator, the state, or an individual, both are equally liable before God, and both are equally accountable before the institutional structures that hold societies together in this world. So and liable for murder.
When you say a state can be liable, what do you mean by that?
The individuals who are acting as agents of the state are responsible for actions that might violate the rights of the people who might be, in the modern terminology, identified as citizens.
Okay, I'm clear.
So it's sort of, it's essentially just doing away with the concept of limited liability or sovereign immunity. That everybody who populates any infrastructure is still base ground an individual human being.
And I think it's beautiful expressed in one of the prophetic traditions. Verily, God is good and pure and only accepts that which is good and pure. And verily, God has commanded the messengers with the same thing he has commanded or has ordained for the messengers, the same things he has ordained for ordinary believers. And so there's, even between the prophets themselves and the generality of believers, there's a commonality of mutual responsibility before the law. And so, to say nothing of those who wouldn't qualify as prophets, but would just be governors or tax collectors or administrators or police officers or soldiers, everyone is equally accountable, and there's no sovereign immunity, to use the term that Davi introduced there.
Very good, very good. So it brings us back to no centralized monopoly on violence. The individual, back to the individual himself is sovereign, but he doesn't have immunity for his actions simply because concept and idea puts itself between that person and justice for their actions. So again, this brings,
or it might not be make believe. It might have some tangible existence in the world, but it still doesn't have the right, as you say, to legitimize actions that will be declared viewed as crimes were they perpetrated by someone outside of that particular context.
It's almost like he just quoted Bastiat. I mean, that's what I just heard. When I just heard the way that you worded that, I just heard you quote Bastiat's The Law, basically, from this is what Islam is, to Bastiat's The Law. I mean, right there. Again, this is why we have these conversations going on, is because there's so many places where there's these commonalities that neither group, neither side really has the access to the information to see that is a reality. And having people like Mark Edge who are and Imam Zaid Shakir who are gracious enough to come on and join us on the air, live, for our listening audience, so that we can have these conversations.
And I think, and it's absolutely critical that we do, because at the end of the day, the nature of the modern world, communications, transportation, various networks have literally placed us in a situation where we are literally all in this together. And unless we have
when we get back, we again will be all together on the air here on the Call to Freedom on LRN.FM.
That would be
And welcome back to the Call to Freedom on LRN.FM. I am Will Coley. I am here with my illustrious co-host, Davi Barker, along with Mark Edge from Free Talk Live. And we have our guest academic tonight. Now, normally we would have an activist that comes on with us in the second hour, but since we have Imam Zaid Shakir, and people want to pick his brain, people love to hear him speak, we made sure we didn't have a second guest for the second hour if he had the ability to, so that he could stay with us as long as he has the ability to do so. And I'm just going to shut up and turn it back over to him and Mark, and let him continue with the point that he was making before we had to take over.
Which was?
You were making a point when we left for break.
Yeah.
Well, if we don't remember, then I'll just jump in.
Let's start another one. Yeah, that works for me too. Let's just go. All right, then, Mark, you got one in the chamber. Let's have another one.
I do. So, being a talk show host and having a whole bunch of different folks from around, so the American political sphere that send me emails, whether I ask for them or not. One of the things is there's these email chains, and many times they're fear mongering about Islam generally. And I just wanted to see what you guys had to say about the idea that Muslims are coming here and trying to change the country. Now, I haven't seen this, but every once in a while you'll get some video of, I don't know, some people who are upset about something. I'm not entirely sure what it all amounts to. And mostly I'm not that concerned. But like, for instance, that the grocery stores not sell pork or something. I have never seen anybody do this, but there's these fear-mongering emails they're out there saying stuff like that Muslims are going to come here and they're going to establish Sharia law, which Will has addressed on Free Talk Live a few times, meaning that Sharia law is really just a...
I think if anyone were going to ban pork, it would be the American Cardiology Society. But and not Muslims, as you said. There are no Muslims. And speaking of Sharia per se, I have a friend. His daughter's name is Sharia. She's a lovely young lady. But it would be prohibited under the rules of Sharia for Muslims to try to, as you say, come into a land that's overwhelmingly not Muslim and try to prevent the people from eating or drinking things that their own religious scriptures or their cultural mores hold to be lawful for them. So Muslims just refrain from eating or buying or consuming those things that our religious teachings hold to be forbidden for us. And there's nothing in our religion that would encourage us in any way, shape, or form to try to impose our views on others. So the whole idea of the Muslim takeover is absurd. From the point of view that Ted Cruz says there's 98 million conservatives in America. So if 98 million conservatives have been fighting for 50 years, if we start with Barry Goldwater's defeat in 1964 to impose their agenda on the country with all of the political muscle that they have, all of the institutional strength that they have, all of the money that they have at their disposal, the think tanks at their disposal, and they failed to do that, then how on earth are anywhere from, depending on who you listen to, 5 to 10 million Muslims who are thoroughly disorganized, politically disenfranchised, relatively speaking, a poor community, individual, upper middle class to a large extent, but there are no Bill Gates in this country, Muslim Bill Gates. There are no Muslim Warren Buffetts. There are no Muslim Koch brothers, etc. How in the heck, even if it were the desire of Muslims to do it, are they going to do it? And it's not the desire of Muslims to do it. So that whole point is
to spell out the strategy. the strategy that these fear-mongering letters say that we are up to as Muslims is demanding our constitutional rights. That's what we're alleged to be doing to take over the country.
Yeah, mashallah. That's
well, I hope you get your constitutional rights. I'm still rooting for anybody to get them at this point.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. People just need to have a broader conversation about what are rights in this country, and if they are rights, Muslims get them too. You don't get to say like that they don't, and they can't advocate for them.
Yeah, no, that's another great point you're making, Dovi. And I think to add to that, who benefits when anyone surrenders their rights? So if these individuals and groups don't want Muslims to have our constitutional rights, they do want certain people to give up their constitutional rights and to surrender them to them. And they're using these various cultural issues and wedge issues to encourage people to give up their rights, to instill fear in them, insecurity in them, and as a result, give up their rights so that certain elements will assume the responsibility of making sure they're safe and secure.
No, I have to agree with that. I mean, particularly our own community. I mean, this is something that I'm seeing in particularly in our religious community, where we can't wait for the opportunity to hand over our rights to the state, particularly certain rights. And it's almost as if we've become so embroiled in the duopoly of political partisanship that we're willing to advocate that our rights be taken away, or basically that we want to hand our rights over. And I mean, we're talking about things, Dr. King understood the importance of being armed in a threatening situation. When the state is targeting you, when the Klan or groups like that are targeting you, having the ability to defend oneself with arms is pretty important. And the state went out of their way to prevent them from being able to exercise those rights. You see a popular photograph of Brother Malcolm, Malik Shabazz al-Hajj, standing in a window, looking out with a gun in his hand, watching just in case there was some type of attack on his family or his property. And now we have the Muslim community, and a large amount of it, who are saying that they want to give up that right specifically, that it's become what is politically accepted or expected in order to be able to associate with the left and be not associated with the right. And in this desire to not be associated with the right, we're now actually going to sell ourselves and our own communities, our own brothers, our own sisters and daughters up the river with no way of protecting themselves.
Well, I think that's where most Muslims are anyway. I think it's one of the great ironies in this situation where people are being encouraged to fear Muslims, and in the name of protecting your Second Amendment rights to be able to arm yourself against the Muslim menace. I can say from my experience, and this is strictly anecdotal, I would say 95% of all Muslim households have no firearms in them. In other words, this whole idea of this threat, it creates the fear that makes Muslims totally vulnerable because Muslim homes aren't armed. The average Muslim out there doesn't own any weapons. And so I think it's even a more dire situation than what
weapons. I personally see a lot of the community is somewhat anti-owning weapons. Like, they'll tell me that my owning arms is a danger to them simply because I'm Muslim. And that's something, that it really it saddens me to see us be willing.
You're saying Muslims say this to you?
All the time on social media. All right, guys, coming back, we'll have Imam Zaid and Mark Edge on the Call to Freedom on LRN.FM. All right, we are back. So it's been a great show so far. We've got Mark and Imam Zaid Shakir back with me and Davi on the other side of the on the other side here, and we're going to turn it back over to Imam Zaid and Mark, and yeah, just let them continue on with this bit of dialogue that we've been having here on the Call to Freedom.
Yeah, Imam Zaid. Again, I've got a question here. There used to be during the Bushes, this Republican machine that used to exist has strong ties to the Saudi Arabian royal family and those sorts of things. And it's my understanding Muslims voted largely for George Bush in the 2000 election.
I think Muslims in Florida, Sami Arian, who was subsequently jailed by the Bush administration, built a block vote of 60,000 Muslims in Florida. If that block had voted for Gore, a lot of subsequent history would have played out very much in a very different way.
I guess what the question I have is that Republicans are generally considered to be socially conservative and fiscally conservative or fiscally moderate. If you just sort of take the Muslim voters in America and you try to put them in that map, they're going to be considered fiscally conservative generally, or fiscally moderate, and socially conservative to socially moderate. And so they would fit the voting profile of a Republican pretty well. And it basically just the way the Republicans have treated Muslims as to how they've reacted, and that's the reason they're largely voting Democrat. Is that right? About right?
Well, it's right to the extent that you look at the Muslim electorate as a monolith. I think if you factor African American Muslims, you'll find a different profile. But to just build on what you said and apply that to sort of the immigrant Muslim community and the descendants of those immigrants, generally a second, and now getting into a third generation, I think that would be largely true. And as I was mentioning offline, when Muslims perceive that a particular party is a threat to their religion, they will generally move away from that party. And so to the extent that there was definitely a lot of identification along cultural lines, along fiscal lines, between a segment of the Muslim community, a large segment, and Republican, the values articulated by the Republican Party prior to this very strong anti-Muslim platform that's been adopted. You had a lot of Muslims voting Republican and supporting the Republican Party, and a lot of wealthy Muslims donating significantly to the party, and they've shifted alliances as a result. And so I think that definitely is a fact and a factor in how a lot of Muslims are aligning themselves politically these days.
I've seen some estimates on that the switch, like with the numbers that voted for Bush, in some like Huffington Post and Mojo, like as much as 80%, 80 to 85% of the American Muslim community voted for Bush in the first administration, most specifically because of the fact that he ran on a platform that he would be a non-interventionist, whereas Clinton had been, someone who would drop bombs on countries at random in order to cover up sex scandals. So this non-interventionist.
And there were other issues, and some individuals very influential in the Muslim community politically got specific guarantees from the Bush campaign they didn't get from Gore, especially around the use of secret evidence that had led to the incarceration of a few Muslim activists, and the guarantee that those activists will be let out and that the secret evidence would not be allowed to be used in subsequent trials of Muslims. So those sort of promises made sort of in the back rooms also played a role in those large numbers that voted for Bush.
So I guess, well, we see that now, even though, we see some of these, and I'll be nice and not say any names, but we see these big name political activists in the Muslim community who like, they have their own spot at the DNC now, and they're putting together their particularly, each particular race's own caucus, the Arab caucus, the Egyptian caucus, the Bangladeshi caucus, and that kind of thing. And we see the same kind of trying to steer the Muslims, vote for this candidate, this candidate said Happy Ramadan, you should send him a thank you email. You should support this particular politician because he acknowledged that Muslims exist. Now, ignore the fact that he voted yes on that last thing that allows us to continue to bomb Muslim children at random. Ignore that, but please send him a thank you note because he said Eid Mubarak to us, and that we still see that attempt by some of these big name political names to steer the Muslim community to voting for their candidate of choice, sometimes, in my own opinion, just to further their own political ambitions in the future.
Yeah, and I think it also reflects a lot of ignorance. I think what you gentlemen are doing, educating the wider public as to the underlying philosophical issues, underlying social and cultural issues that are conducive to effective political involvement and participation. That sort of grassroots education, as you all know, or at least the both of you know, Davi and Will, is non-existent in the Muslim community. And so I think it behooves us, before we really are too stressed out about the political positions and the reasons that they're being taken by certain Muslims, is to engage in this sort of education amongst the Muslim community. And I think if we can do that, you'll see a different outcome. As you all know, I mean, one of the reasons we have just almost a farcical electoral campaigns in this country is just total ignorance on the part of the citizenry. And an informed citizenry is absolutely critical for democracy, absolutely critical for real liberty. And so I think this sort of education is invaluable. On that note, I think at the next break, I'm going to have to cut out. And
hey, we're glad that we had you as long as we did, and
the audience
wow, talk about timing. Wow, talk about timing. Well, you heard that, guys. When we come back, unfortunately, Imam Zaid will no longer be with us. He will be getting back to life. But Mark definitely has questions.
We'll talk,
Imam
Mark.
Zaid. Thank you so much for coming. Jazakallah khair. And assalamu alaikum.
Yeah. Wa alaikum salam. Yeah, Mark, you're in good hands.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Make some doubt.
All right, we are back. Call to Freedom, LRN.FM. We just had, excuse me, a great conversation with Imam Zaid Shakir from Zaytuna Institute and New Islamic Directions. Zaytuna Institute being the very first Islamic university in the United States of America. Imam Zaid is arguably the second most influential Muslim probably on the planet, but most definitely in the country right now. And, having the opportunity to have him on the air with us is, you guys just don't understand how hard it is to get, this guy for a speaking gig or, for an interview. And when we called him up and said, hey, we wanted him to come on and talk to our listeners, it was an instant, yes, can I have 3 weeks and to get prepared? And that was it. So, he was happy to come on, and, we were absolutely honored to have him. But now it's just me, Will, and I have joining with me, though, someone who's very special. You guys know him as the Muslim Agorist. He is my amazing co-host, Davi Barker. And then we also have...
how's it going?
Free Talk Live, Mark Edge. So we
I don't know if you know this, but when I first converted, I lived in Hayward and went to Zaytuna back when it was an institute and not a university or a college. And I used to pray dawn prayer with Imam Zaid almost every day for months on end.
Wow. So I've actually got a roommate. When I first met my wife.
That's what Muslims don't drink. Is they have to be they have to be sober to get up for dawn to pray.
Right. Yeah. Right.
A hungover guy is not going to do that.
Well, you could stay up until dawn, I guess, if you were on that cycle. But
I've heard stories. My wife, she went to college in Malaysia, and I've heard stories of brothers are in the clubs there that they go all night long, and their adhan alarm on their phone goes off, and they put their beer down on the bar and run to the bathroom in the bar and wash up a little bit and throw some cologne and eat a mint, and then go across 2 blocks away to the masjid and go make wudu and then pray, and then as soon as the prayer is over, they go back and they get their beer from the bar and go back to partying.
Well, I mean, I'm definitely on a stay up until dawn schedule when I'm at PorkFest in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
Not me. I need my sleep, and I don't care where I'm at.
Oh, I get my sleep. I sleep till about 10. I go to sleep around 3 or 4. I can function, I function well on 6 hours of sleep. Yeah, I can function well on 3 or 4 hours of sleep, so long as it's good sleep.
Good Quakers don't drink, but I can tell you that at PorkFest, there's usually one night where I go too far, and it seems to happen every year. And I don't know. I always regret it, but nonetheless, it doesn't stop me. So I've got some questions, Will. I remember speaking of Porcupine Freedom Festival, you had said something to me about what made, I think it was the 6 things that make one a Muslim or something.
6 pillars of Iman.
Okay, yeah. And I found these to be sort of very reasonable. Looking at it from a Christian standpoint, I'm not a Christian any longer, but I was raised that way. I'm a Quaker, but what I'd call a non-Christian Quaker. And I found these things to be sort of very reasonable. And I think if people get educated on Islam, that they're going to be less fearful of it. So can you tell me what these 6 pillars are and explain them a little bit?
Sure. Well, the first one is, I guess, is pretty much a given, being as Islam is a monotheistic faith. And that is belief in the singularity of God, the absolute singularness and unity of God.
This is one thing that Muhammad was huge on, was that there was a comparison between the Trinity at the time of Christianity. This is 680, 780, somewhere in there. And the Trinity had taken over as the main philosophy, and those that believed in Unitarians were basically considered heretics. And so in some ways, Islam is essentially just the new
rebirth of Unitarianism. The rebirth.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
it's a Unitarian perennial religion for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the next one would be the belief in the angels. You believe that there are these otherworldly beings outside of natural, what we would call natural creation, the carnal, the physical realm that we see. That there are these beings that are created by God outside of that that they work in different ways for God, either as a conduit for information to bring a message straight from God to humanity, or they have a number of jobs. It's argued in Islam that each man has 2 angels that walk with him at all times, one on one shoulder that writes down the good deeds that he does, and one on the other shoulder that writes down the bad deeds that he does. So you have to believe that angels exist, and that they have these different they have different purposes that that God has given them. The other would,
and that's not much for a Christian belief.
No,
when they talk about powers and
Yeah.
Rulers in heaven.
Another would be.
I like to throw some sense on all of these because there's definitely a difference of opinion about what some of them actually mean.
Yeah, sure.
But I'm just out of curiosity. Does the order matter? Because I learned these in a different order, but maybe that doesn't matter.
I don't think the order really matters. I've always heard.
All right, well then go on.
Tauba. That Tauba is always number one. That's what I've always.
Taqwa.
No, Tauba. The singular.
Tauba is repentance. Taqwa is monotheism.
Tawheed is number one. Oh,
okay, yeah, sure.
Tawheed is number one. That the singularity and the unity of God is number one. And then I've heard them in various, forms after that. But the next one that popped into my head was belief in the messengers, belief in the prophets. That there was an Adam and a Moses and a Jesus and a Muhammad. Peace be and blessings be upon all of them. That there was an Isaiah and an Isaac and a Jacob and a Joseph. That these people existed and that they were communicated with by God in order to bring a message to humanity, and that some of these messengers we don't even know. Like they've just been lost to history.
Oh, I throw Buddha and Krishna in there. I'm very tempted to throw Odin in there.
Well, there's actually arguments. I've heard some arguments that Dhul Kifl is actually the Buddha. I've heard arguments for that and then I've also heard arguments that Socrates was a prophet because of the. They say, that he called people away from their religion and the types of social justice type things that he called to, and like that he was against the centralized leadership of government, all those kind of things.
Ibn Arabi argued that Socrates was a prophet because he fits the motif.
Exactly. So, you have, but we don't know. That's all conjecture. It's not something that we know for sure. So, we can't say that they are or they aren't. But belief in the messengers that do exist is, something that is required by Islam. Another one, let's see here. There's Tawheed. Oh, the belief in the books, in the written word of God, that God has sent messengers that sent a message written down on paper to mankind, and that I think there's five. I believe it's five main books. The scrolls of Abraham, which have been lost to time, which were originally, of course, written down by Abraham or Ibrahim. Then there is the Torah, which came from Moses. Then you have the Psalms of David. Then you have the Injil, or the Good News of Jesus. And then you have El Furqan, or El Quran, of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And El Furqan meaning the discerning book, as it's the one that's supposed to come last, and if there are any issues with the other texts, this is the book that settles those arguments. The Quran is supposed to be the one that you discern with. So, excuse me.
Someone needs a cough button.
Yeah, well, I've been getting over a cold for like 2 weeks, and the belief in the Day of Judgment. So, but yeah, we'll get back to that when we get back, and we'll be back on the Call to Freedom on LRN.FM. And we are back on this live Sunday night, the Call to Freedom. It's our last segment with you guys tonight, unfortunately, but we definitely have plenty left to talk about. So when we left, Mark had asked me about basically, they're called the 6 pillars of Iman. They're things that it's considered necessary for a Muslim to believe in order to be considered a Muslim. So, and if you reject the existence of any of these things, then you wouldn't be able to technically consider yourself a Muslim. As Davi pointed out, there are differences of opinions on the meaning of particularly what each one of these pillars means, the way that it's worded. but they are ostensibly the belief in the oneness of God, the absoluteness in the oneness.
Yeah, the oneness of God. The belief in the angels and the unseen, the belief in the day of judgment, or as I call it, the day of debts, and the sixth is predestination.
Yeah, the qadr Allah is what it's the proper term is, but it's not predestination in the way that Christians understand predestination. It's a little bit different.
Yeah, that's a topic in and of itself.
Yeah, and that before you even ask, Mark, that would literally have to be a whole hour of its own to be able to get into that and kind of dissect that whole thing. Maybe a whole show.
With your list, doesn't that mean that the vast majority of Christians would be considered Muslim by Muslims' standards?
Yes,
I like to think so. Linguistically, I'd say yes.
Linguistically, yes and no, because they do reject the existence or the validity of one of the prophets. Which
that doesn't bother me because a lot of Muslims reject Buddha, and he might be a prophet.
It doesn't bother me either, but I'm just saying, from a traditionalist, a conservative standpoint, because of the fact that they reject that the Prophet ﷺ is a valid prophet, and it's known, like it's not conjecture over whether or not Buddha is. It's conjecture over whether or not Buddha was. It's not conjecture over whether or not, according to the Quran, whether or not the Prophet ﷺ is. So excluding him, like believing whether or not he was spoken to by the angel Gabriel, would mean that you don't actually believe in all the prophets. You believe in most of the prophets.
I would say that at this point in history, it's conjecture. It's conjecture for all of them, and I'm not the only person who says this. Like, this was the position of Imam Ghazali, who's like very famous as a Muslim scholar and a Sufi teacher, and he said that there are some people who believe in the Prophet Muhammad as he lived in history and as it's taught about him, and there are others for whom the Prophet Muhammad is a tyrant that comes from the desert that rapes your children and kills your wives, and those people are rejecting something completely different than what we are accepting, and so it cannot be that they are accountable for that.
Yeah, absolutely, and I completely concur with that position. Well, I guess I guess what I'm saying is
no one knows who the Muslims are. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, yeah. We're told that, though. As Muslims, we're told that no one knows who the Muslims are. That you say La ilaha illallah, and that I can't question it beyond that, so long as you aren't trying to kill the innocent. And at that point, then I have or harm the innocent. At that point, I have the ability to pull out my little book and weigh your actions against your statements. But so long as you say La ilaha illallah, I have no right to judge whether you're a Muslim or you're not. So I mean, and that's simple, plain, basic Islam. That's not like my own opinion. That's established opinion for 1,400 years.
So what about the Trinitarian versus the Unitarian thing? Do Muslims and Christians talk about this at all anymore, or is that some argument from 1,000 years ago?
Well, there's this thing where they like to make fun and kind of like it's inappropriate, but they do it, and there are Muslims who like to have those kinds of debates, and Christians.
Yeah, I see debates among scholars for sure.
Yeah, but among like everyday Muslims, some yes, some no. I mean, it's just like any other group in society. Some people it's important to, and some people just really couldn't be bothered with it. They've got mortgages and stuff to worry about that are far more important.
I don't think most Christians have much of a thought about the triune being of God. I don't think that they spend much time with it, and the back over, bending over backwards that the scholars have had to participate in order to talk about the Trinity. I don't think they think about that very much. They just think God, yeah, Jesus, God too.
Well, if it's not about the Trinity, then it becomes about the personage of Jesus. And I think that this is pretty much only like a hot button issue to people on either side who are trying to evangelize to the other.
Yeah, apologists. Basically, that's who it's important to, and then you have. I think you also have this group of people that they feel like a need they feel threatened by basically by the very existence of another faith tradition, and they need to disprove it. They need to discredit it in order to feel secure in their own personal belief system. So you really can't have a dialogue or any kind of a breakthrough with that kind of person, because they're not there for that reason. Like, they're there to learn specifically with the intention of, all right, I'm going to take this information and then try to filter it through these other sites that give me the confirmation bias that I want, and then I'll come up with my own theory by combining the two, which, that's not an effective way of learning. If you go to someone who's qualified to speak about a topic to learn from them, then that's what you should do. You shouldn't go to like your mechanic and like take notes while he talks to you about the same subject. Unless it's fixing your unless the subject happens to be fixing your transmission.
The other place I see it is among Muslims who it's important to them to be accepted as worshiping the same God as Abraham, and Christians for whom it's important that Muslims not be worshiping the same God as them. And you'll see people debating not necessarily the Unitarian versus Trinitarian aspect of their deity, but arguing that they're not the same, or they are the same deity.
Yeah, like is our Allah and quote unquote the Father the same entity? And any Christian who's from there will tell you, yes, linguistically and etymologically, yes, it is the same deity.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too that they'll say sometimes that Allah is a moon god or something. I'm not entirely sure what that means, but I consider the biblical God to be a mountain god. So whatever. What's your rebuttal to the moon god thing?
It's a reference to pre-Islamic paganism in Arabia. There was a feminine moon goddess named Elat, and if you take the vowels out of the Arabic is like Hebrew, the vowels are diacritical marks, and so if you take out the vowels and you just put in the consonants, Allah and Elat are spelled the same way. And so they say that it's a reference to this moon god, but all that Elat is the feminization of the pronoun Allah. It would be like saying God and goddess. So like it's a linguistic trick is what it is.
Yeah, and that's another thing, is that the moon, there is no moon god in ancient Arab pagan mythology. There is a moon goddess. There's actually 3 of them, but they are not masculine. They are feminine characters. So to say that Allah is the moon god and masculine itself would be incorrect from the position of actually studying pre-Islamic pagan traditions, because there was no moon god. They were only feminine characters. So and the term Allah, though it's given a masculine pronoun, is considered to be gender neutral.
Okay. Yeah, it's just one of those things that gets put out there in like these email chains, and it's difficult to know, what's so and what's not when you read this stuff.
Well, you got the crescent as a symbol too, so that's an easy thing to point at.
But that was taken on by the Turks from the Christians that were there before them. So I mean, it wasn't even a pagan symbol. Well, I mean, if you see Christianity as
it was Persian.
Religion, yeah. I thought it was...
I'm a collector of ancient coins. No, it was the Khusro dynasty of Persia right before Prophet Muhammad. So all of the coins that existed in the Muslim markets for the first generation had moons and crescents on them from Persia. That's where it came from.
Well, the story I'd always heard was that when the Turks came in and took over in Constantinople, that they liked the star and crescent, and that was how it became, because it was the symbol of the Turkish state, and that's how it became associated directly with Islam.
Well, that's possible too, but that'd have been like 1,000 years later.
Okay. All right. Well, that's all the time we have tonight on the Call to Freedom. We've had a great time with you guys. This is Will Coley with Mark Edge and Davi Barker, and we are out.
Thanks, guys.